Let's find out who we have on the podcast today.
My name is David Linden, and I'm the SNP MP for Glasgow East and the party's working pension spokesperson here at Westminster. And I think you were saying you wanted to have something interesting about me. For the last year or so, I have become an avid collector of Hornby trains. So I have it in the auspices of my 6-year-old son, but it's actually me that's really into it. He's just a prop.
And who else do we have?
Hi, I'm Jen Layden. I'm a councillor for the Cllr ward in Glasgow. I'm also the city convener for community empowerment, equality and human rights. I suppose keeping on with a bit of a theme there, I'm an avid cross-stitch fan and currently doing a Star Wars cross-stitch.
There we have, folks. It's the hobby version of the Scotland's Choice podcast today. Well, probably a good question to ask just now is you've both obviously been motivated to get into politics. Starting with you, Jen, what initially got you into politics and how did you come to be part of the independence movement?
I mean, I've been interested in politics from a very young age. Like, many people have been being brought up during the Thatcher era. And really experiencing some of those policies, in my own life. But it wasn't really till 2014 in which I became actively involved in politics. So I voted for independence and happily so was bouncing along Shettleston Road, feeling very proud of myself. And then just when we lost the referendum, I was absolutely heartbroken and immediately joined the SNP and became heavily involved following on from that, working hard as an organiser and election agent, and then finally becoming elected myself to Glasgow City Council. It's been a real journey for myself and has made me more resolute, particularly through my work and how independence is the best thing for our communities in Glasgow and across Scotland.
And David, what was your path to getting involved?
I think it would be fair to say that I was a pretty unusual child. I joined the SSP when I was 11 and I was 31. But I think it's really important to say that, when I got involved in the SNP, it was certainly not a career choice. The seat that I now hold for the party, we took 18% of the vote in 2001. So for me, it was this fundamental belief that Scotland was a nation, and nations would be best served if they governed themselves. And part of it as well is, I'm essentially a child of devolution. So it's interesting listening to Jen there talking about Thatcher. I have no recollection of Thatcher at all. And I think I was born 6 months before Thatcher demitted office. But I remember certainly even at 11 thinking, well, if Scotland can control my kind of school and my nana's hospital and all that kind of stuff, why are we not getting a say on what happens in Afghanistan? And it was certainly probably as I went through my teenage years that I get even more politicised. I always say that politics is a wee bit like quicksand. The more you kind of fight it, the more you get sucked into it, and that's probably how I ended up being in this position here in 2022. But yeah, it was never a career choice for me. It was something that I kind of fell into, but it's it's the best job in the world.
It is interesting hearing people both refer to it. You and I, Jim, would obviously refer to Thatcher. It's interesting hearing people who didn't live through that talking about the fact that they've heard about Thatcher but didn't really kind of know the impact. And I think now we're going through one of those cycles in time when things are repeating themselves, when people are becoming very, very important in the political situation just now, particularly over the subject that we're talking about today, which is the cost of living, because the last time that things were really this kind of critical for people in the households was probably during the Thatcher years. Maybe that'll take us into our topic today. Obviously, the cost of living crisis has an effect globally. There are lots of things that are causing price rises across the piece, but there are specific factors attributing to price rises in the UK. While other countries' wages are keeping up, in the UK wages are, in real terms, lower in 2022 than they were in 2008. What steps do you feel, David, that an independent Scotland could take if it was going to lessen the impact?
Well, I think there's a number of things, Jamie. Firstly, we've got to deal with the issues of poor wages. The idea that people choose to receive unemployment benefit is not actually the case. actually what you find is far too often that the levels of pay in this country, particularly on national minimum wage, bear in mind that is reserved to the UK government here in London, it's pitiful levels of pay. We don't have, for example, the UK government pushing forward with a real living wage as mandated the Living Wage Foundation. And so there's that element of things. There's also a huge element of pay inequality that's baked into the system for young people. If you're under 25, you're not subject to the same level of wages. Actually, when you go to the Asda and Parkhead or Inverness and you fill up your fuel, you don't get your fuel any cheaper because you're under 25. So there's a lot of stuff that we need to do there. There are other things as well that I think we need to do. I mean, the statutory sick pay in the UK is woefully inadequate. So we end up in a situation, particularly during the height of the coronavirus pandemic, where workers were essentially having to choose between whether or not they adhered to important public health measures, maybe not the Prime Minister's strongest suit, I think we would all accept, or indeed, this issue of getting a hit in their pay. So there are many things that those levers that I would like to see us pull, but we can only do that if we're independent. There are, again, examples where, the Scottish Government has the power to do so, mandate people to pay real living wage, particularly as part of the government's business pledge. But far too often with Westminster, there's just a real lack or a willingness to act and bring about pay equality and make sure that people get a fair day's pay.
And Jen, these are, as we've just heard, tough times for people in terms of prices going up. It's not getting easier. We've already seen, the inflation go above 5-6% now. It's tipped to go higher. It's not going to get any easier. And at the same time, we've got a UK government who think it's okay not only to introduce national insurance rises coming soon, but actually to cut universal credit at a time when people are facing these tough times. What do you think would be different if we were independent in terms of how we're looking at treating people in these circumstances?
Well, I think there is a number of things about that. I mean, it's a political choice the UK government are making. And, I know certainly from our own perspective in Glasgow City Council, where we have just set and approved our budget, we have made the political choice to mitigate some of those, issues that are coming through for communities, to try and provide some of that safety net for people. This is about, as I'm saying, a political choice. It's between keeping and eating. How can we support people in our community? So for example, supporting people with financial inclusion. So one of the things that we have done in Glasgow City Council and the Scottish Government are doing the exact same thing, is putting £3 million in to support our citizens and low-income families, disabled people, and really taking that equalities approach to supporting people who are within our communities and who we know are going to be the hardest hit by all of this.
I think there's also a point that, Jen's right, especially to talk about, people with disabilities. I mean, one of the problems that we've seen is not only did the UK government cut that £20 uplift to universal credit, representing the biggest cut to social security since the formation of the modern welfare state, but I think a lot of people forget that the 2.5 million people in the UK who have a disability didn't even get the £20 uplift in the first place. So, that's been subject to court action recently. So it's, it's good that you've got your local authorities that are XMP led, people like, Jen Layden in there who are working really hard to try and, protect people with a disability. But I guess it comes back to that question is, should local government and should indeed national government in Scotland be, a sticking plaster for bad decisions that are taken here that affect people with disabilities?
And of course, you are both representing a city situation. In rural parts of Scotland just now, there's an even worse situation for people. I took a 10-minute rule bill to Parliament highlighting the problems for people that live off the gas grid. And you were talking about filling up your car at and seeing the petrol price that's now shooting up £1.50 and above, and it's probably going to go a lot higher given the international situation just now. A lot of these households are suffering even more. Given we produce the lion's share of oil and gas and renewable energy in the UK, what would be different if we had control over those issues, do you think, here in Scotland?
Well, I think one of the first things would be that, we've seen successive Westminster governments of whatever colour, not, appropriately kind of steward those resources. So you look at some of these countries, like, some of the Scandinavian countries that have got sovereign oil funds, and they've been able to invest in that kind of thing, so that when you do come across tough times that we're at the moment, I think I'd be surprised if we if we peak at 7%, I think it's probably going to be closer to 8%. And you're right, in rural constituencies like yours, energy, bills are going to be a huge problem. But the package that the Chancellor of the Exchequer came forward with recently really won't touch the surface, not least for my constituents, but certainly not for yours, the people that are off the grid. So I think that, an independent Scotland, yes, we all want to have that transition, that just transition away from a reliance on fossil fuels. But it's also about making sure that the resources we've got at the moment are kind of invested wisely. We've also got things like, for example, renewable energy. We're doing magnificent work in terms of generating, serious amounts, like 96, 97% of electricity practically from renewable sources. So I think the Scottish Government is keen to kind of move in that direction. But again, there are some of these issues, that particularly renewables, that the government is opening.
It's interesting on that question of energy, because Scotland overproduces in all its energy sources and exports on all its energy sources. I think you're pointing out quite rightly that we're pretty much near the equivalent of 100% of our electricity production from renewables. And if we can, go further from that, which we will because of the actions that have been taken by the Scottish Government, particularly with the recent ScotWind deal to license the offshore things, which was quite revolutionary and breakthrough. If we could do more of that, then we can do that just transition a bit more stably. But of course, we don't have all the powers to do that. It always comes back to the fact that, the energy powers are still at Westminster. I want to get back to the costs for people, though, and the situation in their households. Jen, you're a councillor, and if you had people coming to you with concerns about what they're going to face over the next couple of years in terms of their household situation.
Yes, we do. I represent a ward, that has high, poverty, and inequality, and we're constantly, trying to come up with solutions to try and address some of that. People are experiencing high costs, and their food that is only going to increase over the coming weeks and months. But I think what's really important for me is, we have lots of food banks. We have lots of organisations that have been helping people, particularly through the pandemic, to try and provide that safety net. And my concern is that as we begin to see, those food prices rising, we'll have an increase in people going to food banks and really looking for that safety net. And one of the other things that really concerns me as well is round about our organisations that support those very vulnerable citizens. They are also seeing the same increases in their fuel costs and their costs as well, which is then going to have a knock-on impact on how many people that they can support as well. So it's kind of in this sort of circle of trying to how do we break out of that, and that again, that's why we come back to saying that in our budget, specifically in Glasgow, we've been putting more money in to try and support those organisations, so that they can then support those individuals and families that really need it the most.
I think there's also a point here, though, Drew, is that sometimes you and I kind of build these corridors in Westminster, but there's some conservatives that seem to think that food banks are a sign of the big society. Actually, it's a sign of really bad policy. The idea that we're having to get local food banks and local charities ploughing in to provide what is the most basic state provision, that is to make sure that people have enough money to heat and eat. You're asking Jen about constituency examples. Even just on Monday before I left Glasgow for Linden, I had a constituent and literally in tears just at the thought of how she was going to be paying her energy bills from April onwards. And I fear, I think this is a point that you'd made quite eloquently during the 10-minute meal bill, but for a lot of people, it's going to move away from a choice between heating or eating to a choice about whether or not you can even afford the heating part of it, let alone cooking the food that you get from the food bank. So, at the moment, the UK government, if you just isn't coming forward with enough by way of kind of ambitious resolutions.
And I think it's important to reflect on the causes of this situation, isn't it? Because yes, that I referred to right at the beginning the fact that yes, there are global conditions. You can't take that out of the equation. Things would have been tougher anyway, but they're made tougher, aren't they? There's a range of things that have happened over the past couple of years, which, as Jen said, are political choices that have happened. One of them, of course, being Brexit. The effect there. I cover international trade, and I've said it many times in this podcast. We've seen a disastrous effect from Brexit on, the ability for companies to export. Now, companies exporting means that they're able to afford to employ employees that are allowed to pay, able to pay them more. and so forth. So them suffering from that is a direct effect in taking money out of the economy, taking wealth out of the economy. I also referred to the cut in universal credit, the national insurance rise. There's a lot of these things that are clear political choices that are being made here at Westminster. What are your thoughts, Jen, about those types of decisions being made with your constituents, those people you've been telling that are coming to you? What are your thoughts about the fact that that's happening without any will from Scotland? Scotland voted against Brexit, and we've got a Tory government, and we neither voted for nor wanted. What are your feelings on that?
I think, obviously, at the time having gone through the EU referendum, and, very proud of Scotland for, voting voting to stay within the EU, that was absolutely the right choice. But obviously being taken out against our will, we are now starting to see that full impact coming on here. There was a lot of, rhetoric put out during that particular campaign of how it would save money and all this kinds of thing. But I
The
think
food prices would be lower, wouldn't they? That was one of the things they said. And energy, and specifically energy prices would be lower as well.
I don't think you got the memo on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, and I even get the sense, amongst people who did vote for Brexit, that if we were to rerun that again, that would be a very different result. And from people that I speak to on the doors, and I've been speaking to people on the doors a lot, and also to constituents, and people who are in sort of academia and such like, and seeing that benefit of independence more and more every day, and how Scotland, with its liberty powers, has been able to mitigate some of those policies. But if we had the full levers and the full political choices, then we would be in a very much different situation.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. I mean, firstly, let's take the national insurance hike. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Brexit and a bus that said, if you voted for Brexit, you get £350 million a week extra for the NHS. I somehow find it a bit strange now that, having voted for Brexit, we're now increasing national insurance by that level, which was essentially a kind of regressive hike. It'll impact the youngest and lowest earners. There's other contributing factors, and Brexit is a really good example of it, where you remove a lot of that labour from the economy, and so we now see things like the HGV driver crisis for 100,000 HGV drivers short. We've got fruit rotting in fields in rural parts of the UK.
And these shortages is important to point out. If you can't get goods to the shops and things are in short supply, that pushes up prices as well.
It does.
It brings us back round to the inflationary.
So it pushes up prices, but also it means as well that the staff that are doing these jobs can command a significantly higher salary. And if you're putting wages up quite so significantly, that then leads into an inflationary kind of cycle as well. So a lot of this is about economic mismanagement, but a lot of it, as you see through, is actually about political decisions that have been taken that are now, I think, coming home.
And that kind of UK self-harm that's been going on is just, affecting people directly. This isn't something that was unavoidable. And what we're also told during the Brexit process is that, if you voted for Brexit, then the EU wouldn't be able to stop you reducing VAT, for example, on energy bills. And of course, what have we seen since the Treasury started getting more money in, because the cost of energy has risen? They've started getting more money in. They're not willing to do anything with VAT. They're not willing to reduce it at all. I want to move on to Scotland's view in terms of the view of Scotland, I should say, in the wider world. Given the growth of, soft power that the Scottish government's been engaging in, this is a time when we're really thinking about international situations quite a lot. Where do you see Scotland's place in the world compared to the UK's place in the world in terms of treating people, both people who live here, and we've just been talking about how we're treating them during the cost of living, or indeed people who were living here or want to live here, and indeed are facing different challenges now, or indeed the way that the new kind of what they call global Britain is projecting us. What are the differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK now? How sharp are they?
Well, I think global Britain is a catchphrase, and I literally just spent this afternoon writing a speech that I'm doing in Westminster Hall later on. I mean, Global Britain's a catchphrase, but we've been on about talking about Global Britain, but so we've actually Poverty Britain. We've got literally 600,000 people more using food banks in the last year compared to the previous one. So yeah, the UK government will come up with these catchphrases, but as far as I can see, the UK has exited the European Union. An act of huge economic self-harm, leaving that trading bloc of 500 million people to go around and do what is, with respect, pretty kind of small beer tiddly trade deals that will nowhere near make up for the costs of Brexit.
Yeah, it could cost money, like
it certainly
such as the New Zealand one.
Yeah,
could actually cost.
and I would certainly question, why it is in terms of air miles, why we would be flying, lamb in from New Zealand, and we could be perfectly plenty of it from your own constituency. But there's also some other stuff as well about, our approach to, for example, refugees. I mean, we're going through this awful period just now. We were looking at what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. Everywhere else in the European Union is looking at what can we do to try and help these people that are fleeing a war. Yet we've got UK government ministers saying to folk, oh, well, you can come here and actually you can help us out with our seasonal worker problem because we've shot ourselves in the foot with Brexit.
Yeah.
So, the way that Scotland behaves, that want to be a kind of outward-looking European country, is compare that to Britain, which is obsessed with migration to the extent that it's actually almost hypocritical, because Brexit for them was about, taking back control of immigration. But actually one of the first things they're going to have to do to get a free trade agreement with, for example, India, is to offer probably 100,000 extra visas. So it's completely cyclical. It's short-sighted politics. Whereas we in Scotland, we want to go out there, we want to trade, we want to be able to welcome people to this country, because for Scotland, immigration has never been a problem. It's been emigration, and you see that fine with islands, for example.
And Jeb, what's your view of the kind of situation between Scotland and the UK in terms of the global position?
Well, I'm glad that David, mentioned immigration policy, because that, it's one key, difference, I think, particularly just now, with the current situation that's going on, where there is that difference in leadership. But, one of the things that I was reflecting on, when I've been thinking about this, is if you have a look at the success that we had at COP26, for example, you saw Boris Johnson sitting there half asleep, whereas, Nicola Sturgeon was out there meeting world leaders, talking to them about independence, really putting forward the case for Scotland, but also talking about all of our excellent, social policy, stuff that we really lead on, or policy we really lead on, not stuff rather. And it's about providing that credible leadership, so that we are a fair and inclusive society. And I think that's where the key difference is. We are positive. We really want to, make our mark and be involved in, in that global setting. And for me, that was a huge success in terms of that difference between the way the UK government behaves and where our Scottish government behaves.
I mean, I think one other example of that, in Jed's absolutely right, COP26 is a really great example of that soft power that was projected by the Scottish government. Now, bear in mind, the Scottish government doesn't have responsibility for foreign affairs, but already, even on issues where we don't necessarily have the powers, we're already in that space trying to do things to show what kind of, world player Scotland would be at the top table. I'll give you just one example. Let's look at international development. The UK had this commitment, a very commendable commitment, to spend 0.7% of GNI on international development. And one of the first things during the pandemic, because of populist politics, probably for Boris Johnson, was to whip that away, whipping away, significant amounts of money for the world's poorest people. The Scottish government doesn't have control over international development, but still funds projects, for example, in Malawi. So it's that strong social conscience that doesn't just stop at Coldstream. It's a world view that we've got, and we want Scotland to be able to get out there, play its part in the world, and at the moment we're being hampered by an intransigent Westminster government that's just so focused and inward looking on itself.
Indeed, and we could do so much more. I mean, so many of these things you're talking about kind of underline the UK government's obsession with short-termism and approaches to crises, which we see. You were referring to the EU and the response to, for example, the humanitarian crisis and taking in refugees. All 27 countries saying, yes, we'll waive rules for 3 years, visa rules, so that people can get safe haven. And you pointed out, people get back to the cost of living. There's another good example of that short-termism just now with the Chancellor's, buying out or payday loan, isn't it, that he's offering to help for people with their energy prices. a £200 loan, so which you can't take, opt out of. It's going to come to you, and you have to pay it back over 2 years. That what kind of signal do you think that sends to people in terms of the support that they should be getting? Jen, what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't know so much on that. I mean, I just, just sort of beggars belief that, this is a situation that's being caused by the UK government, and yet what they want is more people to put themselves into more debt, so that, they don't actually have to put any effort into developing, policy and legislation that actually protects people and protects their well-being. It's a bit of a sort of lazy politics, in a way. It's not taking any thought about how they will protect anybody and provide that safety net.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the other issue as well is that, I mean, some of this is just symptomatic of, a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's probably, I think the richest MP in Parliament. I don't think he's probably worrying about, when the next bill from Yon comes into the inbox or through letterbox. But one of the things that we've been arguing for is, a low income, payment to families to help them with their energy bills. Many of my constituents, they don't have the money now, and frankly, they're not going to have the money in 2 years' time. So this almost kind of Wonga like approach that the government's having in terms of, almost like a payday loan to try and pay your energy bill. But also, I mean, I think it's what, a couple of £100. I mean, we'd actually expect
It's not very touch aside.
bills are going to go up by about £600, and that was frankly before what we saw with the Russia conflict. So I think, all those kind of projections, inflation are going to have to be looked at again. There's also the issue as well, frankly, that later on this year, you see the cap raised again in September. So the UK government has to move away from these short-term policies and actually come forward with longer-term solutions, because the problem is that when you come forward with these short-term policies and you whip away that support too quickly, as we saw, for example, with the furlough scheme, the £20 a week extra for universal credit, you whip away that stuff far too quickly. You end up only having to go back and fix it again, which I love short-term fix. So some of the stuff that we've been speaking about, whether that's reduction in VAT on energy, whether it's the low income payment, that's stuff that could really kind of tangibly help people. The UK government's only focused in the next.
This podcast is obviously about Scotland's choice. It's about the differences between Westminster and what Scotland would do with it. We see at Westminster that money can be found for bankers and fraudulent COVID contracts in the billions, billions of pounds, but not to subsidise energy bills. In the Scottish Parliament, you've got a Scottish government, but we talked earlier about the universal credit cut of £20 a week, bringing in a £20 a week child payment, and a range of other supports for people in their houses, doing all this mitigation. We've got things like the bedroom tax and so forth. Do you feel it's a frustration that we're having to do all this mitigation, where if we just had the power, if we had the powers of independence, or even the powers of our social security, we could do so much more for people to help them out?
Well, I mean, so the special rapporteur had made this point specifically about, mitigation comes at a cost. So we said somewhere between £60 and £80 million a year mitigating bedroom tax through discretionary housing payments for local authorities. Now that's £60 to £80 million that we don't have today and spend in the NHS. I've just come from a catch up with cancer event, so that's money that we can put into supporting people who are going through a cancer diagnosis. Likewise, my colleagues in local government could always do with more money in terms of, fixing potholes and stuff like that. But at the moment, we are spending far too much of our money trying to mitigate bad welfare policy that comes from Westminster. And on that very point of Scotland's choice, that choice that people have is, what does devolution mean to you? Is devolution about making sure that you can invest in things like education, health, justice, transport? Or is it increasingly about spending money, for example, doubling the Scottish child payment, which is essentially nullifying to that £20 cut to universal credit?
Yeah. And Jen, what's your thoughts on that? Do you find that a particular frustration?
I find it a huge frustration, particularly for constituents, and when we're trying to do, work at a local government level, to, looking at, how do we empower more communities and things. I mean, we've done a lot of work in terms of Glasgow City Council in, trying to support families, and it is a huge frustration too. So, I mean, one of the things that we had brought in very, very early on in our term was around a holiday activity programme, where we set aside £2 million and that was to be able to feed school kids during the term time. Now, again, it's coming back to that. That's a political choice we made. That's something that we wanted to do to be able to help families and children. But this is a direct result of, all of the UK austerity policies that we are having to mitigate against.
And this is the issue here, is that, that's Glasgow City Council and the holiday activity programmes are a really good example of that. That's £2 million that could be spent on, for example, more teachers, lower class sizes. But we're in a situation where a local authority is essentially having to feed people during the summer holidays because the UK government can't get its act together and make sure that people get a fair day's work, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, or indeed they'll get adequate levels of social security. My thing is that local authorities shouldn't be having to step in and feed children lunches during the school holidays. That is not the job of local authorities. That is the job of the UK government to make sure that we have an economy that works for people. And if the UK government aren't willing to take those decisions, then Scotland has that choice to become an independent country. And I'm increasingly confident that people post-2014 are looking at it very differently now.
Well, we're not going to talk about the fact that we were forced into Brexit much more. We've covered that already in this podcast. But what Brexit has led to is a real impact on imports from the EU. Food and drink imports from the EU are down 15%. Just now, we import about 80% of our food ingredients. So there is a situation just now where the UK government have got more choices that they should be taking advantage of, but they're not. There's a real impact, isn't there, on food prices just now? Because we've seen from campaigners have been pointing out that food and price inflation hits those who are poorest the most. So we've seen, for example, 141% increase in the cost of pasta, 344% in the cost of rice, canned spaghetti, 170%. This is all caused by red tape, and we simply wouldn't have that red tape situation if we'd remained in the EU, which Scotland wanted to do. What influence can we have on the UK government now, David, in getting them to deal with this issue? How confident are you that they're willing to deal with this?
Well, I mean, you and I can stand up in the House of Commons and make speeches about this until our blue in the face, and we can refer to, for example, Jack Monroe and the excellent work that she's been doing to try and highlight some of this. But I mean, fundamentally, it comes back to these decisions about what kind of trading nation do we want to be? Do you want to go down that kind of protectionist, insular route that the UK government went with Brexit, or do you want to just admit that we are an island nation, we are going to have to import quite a lot of stuff? The problem is that for many of my constituents, things like your pasta or your rice going up by 141-300%. That has a real impact on them, because for most of my constituents, they're living, frankly, month to month, hand to mouth. And yes, the Chancellor of the Exchequer probably wouldn't even be able to tell you how much a bag of pasta actually costs. But for many of my constituents, now they're having to think, right, how can I make that bag of rice last a bit longer? And that, frankly, means putting less, on their plate. Less food in your plate means, less food in your tummy. And for small kids, that means less ability to
So
class.
difficult.
So these things have a long-term effect.
And that's why school meals are so important now, Jen, aren't they? Yeah, it's not just though. I mean, we've been talking about the Scottish Government having to take action to mitigate cuts, but it's not just about that. Some really progressive policies that were taken forward in Scotland, aren't there, Jen? I mean, you were talking about things that you're doing in Glasgow there, but if you look at things like the under 22s free bus travel, the baby box, free prescriptions, cheaper council tax, school uniform grant. Those are really important free school meals. But there's also things like the Best Start grant, free dentistry, the early learning payment. I mean, I could go on, and there is a lot more I could go on. Free eye tests. You could go on with a big list of things there that we're doing for people. That is what a progressive society should be doing for people. It should be looking at, this kind of universal ability to access these things, isn't it, Jen?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And on all of those that you've read off to, I mean, that is the demonstration of a progressive society, and one that, it has been built into, the SNP's manifesto, our programme for government, and something that we continue to we continue to implement, and we will always look for ways to bring in those new policies. And I think that makes us a world leader in terms of some of those social policies in which we see Other countries also following suit. So yeah, I mean, I think only with independence can we achieve those full levers and political choices without having the UK government on our backs.
This is one hand tied behind our back, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's fundamentally comes down to the kind of social contract that exists between citizens and their government. So, for example, we invest in things like, free tuition because we believe that education should be based on your ability to learn or your ability to pay. I mean, sometimes I do find myself kind of wincing a little bit when we talk about, free tuition and free prescriptions. All of this is paid for by our taxes. But that is because we as a society, that is because we as a country and indeed a government have decided that in order to have good public services, we will resource that. And we know that when you've got, that investment in, for example, your education system, the outcomes are a hell of a lot better. You're not looking at, university students having to say, well, look, I can't afford 40, 60,000 pounds worth of debt. So a lot of this comes back to that social contract that exists between the Scottish government and the people who have done us the immense pride of living and working, settling in our country.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, a lot of this, we are doing things with one hand tied behind our back. So yeah, take for example education policy. We've got that free tuition that's in place. But then there's all the stuff around the post-study work visas where we've got people that are no longer able to come here. So if we had control over things like immigration, we could have a much broader suite of policy options available to us. But that is not a choice, and this the podcast is specifically about Scottish choice. That's not a choice that exists at the moment under this broken Westminster system.
Indeed. And there are other challenges ahead, aren't we? The world economy has reached a point where it's the most imbalanced it probably ever has been in terms of, certainly in modern times, between the rich and poor. Over 50% of the world's wealth is held by just 1% of individuals. I mean, that's something that's going to, if things continue as they are, particularly under the direction of Westminster, where we've seen that becoming worse, then it's only going to get worse for people. Where what we've been talking about is that we could have a more progressive approach. Back in 2014, there were arguments that were being made there by the No campaign, as I said, referred to some of the promises that were made over Brexit. We were told that we'd remain, if we voted yes, we'd be kicked out of the EU, for example. There's a whole list of things that we could go through, and we've covered them.
Pensions, double law,
all of these things have since gone.
Off a dike.
How have the arguments over, the big arguments of the day were, you've just mentioned pensions there, the big arguments were, things like the currency and the borders. Do you think these arguments still hold the same resonance today, or have they changed?
I mean, I think certainly people are, they're interested in them. I remember, let's take the currency issue, for example. I remember being out campaigning in the Lilybank area of my constituency in Deacon Jen's wards in 2014. And it was perceived at the time that the currency was a really weak issue for the Yes campaign. And I remember pressing the flesh with one of the ladies in the doorstep, and I was like, "Tell me what you make of this currency stuff." And she said to me, "Do you know what, son? I don't have any currency in my pocket at the moment at all. I don't care whose head's on the coin." And for her, she understood that independence is about, having the ability to have, complete free reign and control over your own economy, which we don't have at the moment. So yeah, I think things like currency, the border and stuff, really, really important. And I think there's a lot more that the Scottish Government are doing to engage people in conversation about that. But I think when you outline that much broader picture about what kind of society that you want to have, invest in public services, that's the thing that people are really focused on. But yeah, we're absolutely alive to the fact that people might have concerns over currency, the border, pensions, but we have a plan for that in the same way that every other country that's become independent has had a plan. So that's the basis.
And Jen, do you feel that's the same for you?
Yeah, I feel that's absolutely the same. I mean, going on the doorsteps, it's not something that you're often asked about the currency. You will get some people that will talk to you about immigration policy, but that might be that they're from the other side of the argument and they support the UK government. But as David is saying, for most people, it's about what's going on in their lives and their local communities that impact them the most. And it's not usually these bigger sort of economic arguments. They're just wanting to be able to feed their children, send them to a good school, get education, and be able to, be able to put food on your table. So those are some of the key issues. And I think with those social policies that the SNP have brought through have really made such a difference to so many people. And that's why I think we are seeing, so much more support and so much more readiness for people to make that choice to independence.
So, Jed, look into the future in an independent Scotland. We'll have a vote. I believe that people will vote yes in that vote. If you could implement one policy or to change a policy that we currently can't change, what would you like to see into the future?
Well, one of the number one, and it's key on my mind, and we have mentioned this already, but this is immigration policy. You know, I just feel that it's a disgraceful policy. It's a disgraceful way to treat people. That's not the way that we should be, you know, having a fair and inclusive society. You know, the fact that asylum seekers don't, you know, have the right to work at the moment. They have to go through this horrific asylum system. You know, the accommodation, and, you know, have been quite heavily involved in Glasgow and asylum dispersal. We've seen the direct impact on people's health and well-being of these policies. Now, we can only mitigate so far on that as well. You know, our hands are tied as a local authority. Accommodation goes to private contractors. You know, and they are interested in the bottom line, which is, you know, the profit margins. So that is one policy that I would really love to see in the hands of an independent Scotland.
And for you, David, what would be the policy you'd want to see?
I mean, it's one of the ones that I work on regularly, Drew, in the Department of Work and Pensions brief, and that's on statutory sick pay. I never again want to be in a situation where I am actively speaking to people on the phone who said, "Hey, look, son, I have tested positive for COVID, but I can't afford to take time off work." Yeah. The idea that people were putting other folk at risk during the height of a pandemic absolutely kind of highlights just how broken the statutory sick pay system is. And you can look, for example, some of the Scandinavian countries, whether it's Germany, pretty much everywhere else in Europe has a much more generous level of statutory sick pay, but we cannot ever again end up in a situation where people are being forced between, you know, adhering to public health or trying to think about what's in their wallet. That is just not the way to do things. And unfortunately, for so long as we're part of this broken union, statutory sick pay will remain a policy that is under the control of the UK government, and I'm afraid that an intransigent policy in which they have no intentions of reforming.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it there. Councillor Jed Linden and Councillor Jed Layden and David Linden MP, thank you very much for joining me on this Scotland's Choice podcast.
Thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Drew, and I think you almost had me married off to my life. So.